Richard Holloway slammed his palm on the conference table hard enough to rattle the water glasses, and every head in the room snapped toward him. "You want to talk numbers?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt as he pointed one finger directly at Ava Sinclair. "She started as a nurse, and you people handed her the keys to $1 billion company." He laughed, a short, ugly sound that filled the room. "Get her out of that chair before she runs this entire operation into the ground." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear someone breathing 3 seats away. And right there in that moment, the whisper no one expected was coming, a whisper that would change everything. Before we go further, if this story already has you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Ava Sinclair did not flinch. That was the first thing Lucas Bennett noticed about her, and it was the thing he would think about for weeks after. Every other person at that table had either looked down at their notepad or shifted in their chair when Richard Holloway opened his mouth. The general counsel had suddenly found something fascinating in the corner of the ceiling. The CFO had pressed his lips together and studied the surface of the table like a man reading his own future in the grain of the wood. But Ava Sinclair sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, her eyes were on Holloway, and her expression hadn't moved a single centimeter. Lucas was sitting at the far end of that table, the most junior person in the room by title and by age, compared to most of the partners, and he had been brought in only to present the Q3 analysis he'd spent 11 days preparing. He had no business being in the middle of whatever this was. But here he was, and he was watching Ava Sinclair with the helpless attention of someone watching a storm decide whether to break. Richard Holloway was 62 years old, broad-shouldered in the way men get when they've been powerful long enough that their body starts to express it, and he had been on the board of Sinclair Medical Technologies for 9 years. He had voted against Ava's appointment as CEO. He had voted against her strategic pivot 3 years ago. He had been wrong both times, and that wrongness had apparently settled somewhere inside him like a stone he couldn't pass. "I'm not being personal," Holloway said, though his tone made it clear he absolutely was. "I'm being precise. We have a woman in the chief executive seat who came up through clinical work. Nursing, she does not have the background for what this company is about to face. The acquisition is on the table. Meridian is waiting. And we are sitting here pretending she can navigate a 9-figure merger when she has never once operated at that level." The general counsel, a careful man named Philip Wren, who had been with the company almost as long as Holloway, cleared his throat. "Richard, the financials from the last 4 quarters. I've read the financials." Holloway cut him off, and "I know how to read a spreadsheet, Philip. What I'm saying is that there is a ceiling, and that ceiling is the person sitting in the chair." Ava let him finish. She let the silence after his last words stretch out for 3 full seconds, long enough that it became its own kind of statement. Then she reached forward, picked up the pen beside her notepad, and uncapped it. Not because she was going to write anything. Lucas would realize that later. She uncapped the pen and set the cap beside it with a small, deliberate click, and that tiny sound was the only indication that she had heard a single word Holloway said. "Richard," she said, and her voice was so quiet that everyone leaned forward slightly. "You've said that. You've now said a version of that in 3 consecutive board meetings." She looked at him directly, and something in her gaze made Holloway's jaw tighten. "Are you expecting a different response each time, or are you hoping I'll eventually agree with you?" Holloway's face went a shade darker. "I'm expecting accountability." "Then you'll get it," she said. "From me, to the board. In the format and schedule outlined in the governance agreement you signed, not in this room, not in this tone, and not in response to a speech that you clearly rehearsed." She glanced at Philip. "Are there other items on today's agenda that require this full group?" Philip blinked. "There's the Meridian timeline update." "Then let's do that." She turned to the slides on the screen at the end of the room without looking at Holloway again. "Lucas, the Q3 numbers." Lucas realized for one disorienting moment that she was talking to him. He had met Ava Sinclair twice before this. Once at his orientation when she had walked through the analyst floor with her COO, pausing at each desk for approximately 45 seconds. She had stopped at his, looked at the work open on his monitor, asked him one question about his methodology, and listened to his answer with the complete attention of someone who was genuinely deciding whether the answer was good. He had been there for 3 weeks at the time. He had the strange feeling afterward that she had learned more about him in 45 seconds than most people did in a full conversation. The second time was in the elevator. She had been on her phone reading something, and he had ridden 12 floors in silence next to her. She had stepped off without looking up. He wasn't sure she'd noticed him at all, but she knew his name. And right now, with every face in the room turning toward him, that single syllable, Lucas felt like being handed something unexpectedly heavy. He opened his presentation and talked. His voice was steady because he made it steady, and because the numbers were solid and he knew them well enough that he didn't need to think about them. He talked about the Q3 performance data, the year-over-year trajectory, the 3 risk scenarios he'd modeled for the Meridian acquisition timeline. He talked for 14 minutes, and when he finished, there were 4 questions, and he answered all 4 of them. Holloway didn't ask any questions. He sat with his arms crossed and looked at the table. Ava, for her part, watched Lucas's presentation with the same careful attention she'd given him at the desk 9 months ago. She asked the 4th question herself, a precise 2-part question about the variance in his second risk scenario, and when he answered it, she made a small note on her notepad, nodded once and said, "Good work." 2 words. But in that room at that moment, with Holloway still radiating his silent hostility from the other end of the table, those 2 words felt like something. The meeting broke 40 minutes later. People filed out in the careful, purposeful way people file out of rooms where something uncomfortable has happened and nobody wants to be the one who acknowledges it directly. Lucas was packing his laptop when he heard Holloway's voice again, lower now, aimed at Philip Wren just outside the door. "She's not going to last the year," Holloway said. "I'm telling you, there are things happening with her that you don't know yet. She won't be in that chair by January." Lucas didn't know what that meant. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself a lot of things in the following minutes, walking back to his desk on the 14th floor, sitting down, opening his laptop, trying to return to the ordinary texture of the afternoon. He couldn't quite get there. It wasn't the drama of the board meeting that stayed with him. It was the way Ava Sinclair had sat through it, the way she had held herself so completely still, and yet he'd had the distinct impression, the kind of impression you can't explain, but also can't dismiss, that holding still was costing her something. He didn't know her. He had no reason to think anything about her beyond the professional. He filed the whole thing under the category of things that are not your problem and opened his spreadsheet. He ran into her again that evening. It was past 8. Most of the 14th floor had emptied 2 hours ago. Lucas was still at his desk because the Meridian variance analysis needed to be refined before morning, and because going home to his apartment had a way of feeling like arriving at a place that wasn't quite finished yet. He had been divorced for 14 months. The apartment was fine. It was perfectly adequate. It had everything he needed and nothing he wanted, and most nights he preferred the hum of the office to the specific quality of quiet that waited for him there. He was in the small kitchen on the 14th floor, making coffee he probably didn't need when he heard footsteps in the hallway and turned to find Ava Sinclair standing in the doorway. She looked different. Not worse, not diminished, just different. The boardroom version of her had been assembled with the precision of something load-bearing. This version was still composed, still contained, but the assembly was slightly looser, and the difference was enough to make Lucas feel briefly like he was seeing something he hadn't been meant to see. She was carrying a file folder and a phone, and she stopped when she saw him as if she hadn't expected the kitchen to be occupied. Coffee, he offered, because it was the only thing that made sense to say. She looked at the pot. Is it the good kind or the kind that tastes like a building? He almost smiled. The building kind. I can make the good kind if you have 5 minutes. She considered this. Then she came into the kitchen, set her folder and phone on the counter, and sat on one of the stools like a person making a decision they haven't fully committed to yet. He made the coffee. They were quiet for a moment, and the quiet between them was oddly comfortable, not the blank silence of strangers, but the particular silence of 2 people who are each trying to figure out where exactly they are. "Your second risk scenario," she said without preamble. "The variance you mentioned. You were conservative with it." He looked at her. "I was. Why?" "Because the aggressive projection requires assuming Meridian's integration timeline is realistic, and I don't think it is. Their tech stack is messier than the due diligence report suggested. If I'm wrong, the conservative number still beats our baseline. If I'm right, the conservative number is the one we actually want to have on record." She was quiet for a moment, processing. How long have you been thinking that about the integration timeline? 6 weeks. Why didn't it appear in the report 6 weeks ago? It was a direct question, not hostile, not accusing, just direct in the way that extremely capable people are direct when they've decided you're worth being direct with. Because 6 weeks ago, I was still new enough that I wasn't sure if my read was right or if I was just being paranoid, he said. I needed more data before I put it in writing. And now I'm sure. She lifted her coffee cup, held it with both hands, and looked at him. Send me the detailed breakdown tomorrow. Not through Philip, directly to me. Okay. And Lucas. She said his name the same way she had in the boardroom, without effort, without signaling anything, just as a fact. The work you presented today was very good. I mean that specifically, not as encouragement. He nodded. I could tell the difference. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the movement in her face that happens just before one. Good, she said. That's useful. She picked up her folder and her phone. Go home at a reasonable hour. You too, he said before he had thought about whether that was appropriate to say to the CEO. She was already at the door. She paused. I have a meeting at 9:30 that I couldn't move. A beat. Go home at a reasonable hour on my behalf. Then she was gone, and Lucas stood in the kitchen with his coffee and the distinct feeling that something had just started, though he could not have told you what. Over the next 3 months, the pattern established itself without either of them naming it. The Meridian acquisition moved forward, and Lucas's analysis had been right about the integration timeline, right enough that Ava restructured the due diligence process mid-negotiation based largely on the detailed breakdown he'd sent her. The deal was better because of it. He knew this not because anyone told him so explicitly, but because the decisions being made upstream of him began to reflect his numbers in ways that didn't happen by accident. He and Ava crossed paths regularly, in meetings in hallways, twice in the parking garage when they were both working late. They talked about the work. They talked about strategy. Occasionally, they talked about other things, a book she referenced that he happened to have read, a running argument she was having with the operations team that she described with a dry humor that caught him off guard the first time and delighted him every time after that. He learned things about her in pieces, the way you learn things about people who are careful about what they reveal. She had grown up in a small town in Tennessee. She had put herself through a nursing program, then a business degree, then an MBA, all of it paid for by working. She had started in the clinical side of the company's predecessor firm 15 years ago, and she had built her way up through every department with a relentlessness that the people who had known her then described in tones that mixed admiration and something close to awe. She did not talk about her personal life. She mentioned no family, no partner, no one waiting for her anywhere. She lived in a city of millions and seemed to occupy it alone, and Lucas was careful not to notice this too much. He was not in a position to notice anything about anyone's aloneness. He was barely navigating his own. He had been married for 6 years. Elena had been warm, patient, and ultimately miserable in the life they had built together, and they had both been too loyal and too stubborn to admit it until they were too far in for the admission to save anything. The divorce had been civil, which somehow made it worse. There was no villain in his story. There was just two people who had wanted different things and spent too many years trying to want the same things until the effort had worn them both down to nothing. He was 34 years old and starting over, and he was fine. He kept telling himself he was fine because most of the time it was true, and on the days it wasn't true, he had learned to keep the falseness of it tucked somewhere it didn't interrupt his work. Ava, for whatever reason, seemed to understand this about him without his having said it. Not because she probed or asked questions, she did neither. But she had a way of responding to him that felt like talking to someone who had read the notes but wasn't going to bring them up unless he did. He trusted her with things he hadn't intended to trust her with. Not confessions, not revelations, just small, honest things, the kind that slip out between people who are spending real time together. He told her once that he was still not sleeping well. She told him she hadn't slept more than 5 hours at a stretch in 2 years. They were standing in the hallway outside the strategy room. The conversation lasted 90 seconds, and neither of them referred to it again, but something had changed in the air between them, and both of them knew it. It was a Thursday evening in November when she told him. They were the last two in the building again, or close enough to it. He had come to her office to drop off a revised projection she'd asked for, and she had told him to sit down And then she had sat across from him and folded her hands on the desk and said without warming up to it in any way, "I have cancer." Lucas said nothing. "Breast cancer," she continued. "Stage 2. I've been in treatment since July. Surgery is scheduled for January 14th. She said it the way she said most things, cleanly without decoration. But her hands, he noticed, were pressed flat against the desk surface in a way that was slightly different from her usual stillness. "I'm telling you because you have been working closely with me and because you're perceptive enough that you'll figure it out eventually anyway, and I'd rather you know from me." He looked at her. His first instinct was to say he was sorry, and he stopped himself because he'd heard her enough by now to know that sorry was not what she wanted. Sorry was what people said when they didn't know what else to do with their discomfort. "Okay," he said instead. She blinked. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it was real. "Okay," she repeated like she was testing the word. "The surgery in January," he said. "Where does that put the meridian close?" Something crossed her face, quick and complicated, gone, before he could name it fully. But it looked for just a moment like relief. "The closest scheduled for December 28th. It'll be done before the surgery. And if it runs over, it won't. But if it does," she held his gaze for a moment, "then Philip has everything he needs to carry it across the finish line." She paused. "I don't intend for it to run over." "I know," he said. "I'm just asking so I know the actual contingency plan." She told him, quietly, precisely the way she always talked about plans, as though a plan properly laid was the best available armor against the things you couldn't control. He listened. He asked 2 more questions. She answered them. When they had finished, she said, "I need you to not tell anyone, not Philip, not anyone on your team, not anyone." "I understand." "I mean it, Lucas." "I know you mean it," he said. "I'm not going to tell anyone." She nodded once. She looked at the window. Outside, the city was doing what the city always did, moving. Lit up, indifferent to everything happening in this room or any other room. "Are you scared?" he asked. He hadn't planned to ask it. She was quiet for a long time. Not evasive quiet, just the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer honestly. "Every single day," she said finally. "Yes." It was the most unguarded thing he had ever heard her say. It cost her something to say it. He could tell the way her jaw moved slightly after, like she was absorbing the weight of having let those 4 words out into the air. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't say she was strong. He didn't offer her any of the things people reach for in these moments because they can't stand the nakedness of the real. "I know," he said, and that was all. And somehow, impossibly, that was exactly right. She didn't look at him. She kept looking at the window. But something in her shoulders changed just slightly, just enough, and the room felt different than it had 60 seconds ago. Lucas drove home that night and sat in his car in the parking garage of his building for 11 minutes before going inside work. He sat there and thought about the woman he worked for and the things she was carrying completely alone, and the way she had said every single day, in that voice that was trying its hardest not to show him how true it was. He thought about what it meant that she had told him. And he thought about how, when she had looked at him across that desk and said the word cancer in the same tone she used to discuss acquisition timelines, he hadn't felt sorry for her at all. What he had felt was something closer to the opposite of that something that was quietly, insistently, and alarmingly beginning to feel like the most important thing he had encountered in years. He went inside. He made dinner he didn't taste. He went to bed. He lay there in the specific dark of his specific apartment and stared at the ceiling, and the last coherent thought he had before sleep finally came for him was simple and certain and entirely unwelcome in its clarity. He was not going to be able to keep this professional. He sent her the revised meridian projections at 6:40 the next morning before she'd arrived. She responded at 6:52 with 2 comments and a question. He answered the question. She didn't respond again until 9, and when she did, it was just, "This works." No greeting, no sign-off. Just the acknowledgement that the thing was right and they could move forward. That was how they operated. And for the next 3 weeks, Lucas told himself it was enough. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough on a Tuesday afternoon when he passed her in the hallway outside the executive conference room and caught the exact moment she pressed one hand flat against the wall just briefly, just for a second before straightening and continuing past him like nothing had happened. He kept walking. He didn't say anything. But he'd seen it, and she knew he'd seen it, and when she glanced back at him from 6 feet away, her expression was the expression of someone who has been caught doing something they intended to do privately. "Don't," she said quietly. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." He wasn't. He had been about to say nothing at all because he understood by now that saying things directly to Ava Sinclair, when she didn't want them said, was the fastest way to close every door she had cautiously started to leave open. "I was going to ask if you'd had a chance to look at the Meridian counter-proposal," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, deciding whether that was true. "Send it to my phone," she said. "I'll read it tonight." She turned and walked away. Her shoulders were absolutely straight. Her stride was completely even. She looked exactly like herself, which was exactly what she was working so hard to look like. He sent her the counter-proposal. At 11:15 that night, his phone buzzed with 3 paragraphs of her notes. He read them, lying on his couch with the lights off. They were precise, thorough, and completely correct. He typed back, "All of this. I'll have the revision ready by tomorrow morning." She sent back one word. "Good." He stared at the ceiling for a while after that. The Meridian deal was consuming everyone. The close date of December 28th was not flexible, and as November ground into December, the pressure inside the building took on a particular quality, the kind that gets into the walls and the air, and the way people talk to each other in the elevator. Lucas was pulling 12-hour days regularly. He suspected Ava was pulling longer ones, though she never said so, and her schedule was the one thing she guarded with absolute privacy. Holloway surfaced twice in December. The first time was in a board communication that circulated among senior leadership. Lucas received it because he'd been added to the distribution list for the Meridian project, in which Holloway raised formally and in writing what he called concerns about executive capacity without naming anyone specifically. Philip Wren spent 45 minutes on the phone with Ava after that communication went out. Lucas knew because Philip's assistant mentioned it while looking for a file. He didn't ask any follow-up questions. The second time was more direct. Lucas was walking out of the building on a Thursday evening when he heard Holloway's voice behind him in the lobby talking to someone Lucas recognized as a member of the company's public relations team. He wasn't trying to overhear, but Holloway wasn't being careful. "There will be an announcement," Holloway was saying, "sooner than people think, and when it comes, you'll want to have positioned yourself correctly. That's all I'm saying." Lucas pushed through the revolving door and kept walking. He didn't know what announcement Holloway was referring to. He had 3 theories and didn't like any of them. He thought about telling Ava. He went back and forth on it for 2 days, and then he made himself a decision. He would tell her the truth, and he would let her decide what to do with it. That was what you did when you respected someone. He knocked on her office door at 7:30 on a Friday evening when the floor had mostly cleared. "Come in." She was at her desk, which was covered in a controlled arrangement of papers and folders that would have looked like chaos to anyone else, but that Lucas had learned to read as a functional system. She had her reading glasses on, something she took off when people came into the room, and that she had stopped bothering to take off when it was him. That small detail kept doing things to his chest that he was doing his best to ignore. "I heard something," he said. He told her exactly what Holloway had said, in what context, with what tone. He didn't editorialize. He just reported it. She listened with her hands flat on her desk and her eyes on him. When he finished, she said, "How long ago Thursday? I've been deciding whether to tell you." "What made you decide to?" "You told me something that mattered in October," he said. It seemed like the wrong thing to do, to hold back information that might be connected to it. Something moved in her face. She looked down at her desk for a moment, then back at him. "Richard has been trying to orchestrate a board vote 4 months. He needs 6 members. Currently, he has 4, possibly 5. She said this like she was discussing weather patterns, measured analytical. But her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was containing something larger than what she was showing. "He's looking for leverage. The announcement he was referencing." She paused. "I think he knows about the diagnosis." The room got very quiet. "How ardent?" Lucas asked. "I don't know. I was careful." She picked up her pen, set it down. "I have been careful about everything." The last sentence had an edge in it that she clearly hadn't intended. She pressed her lips together and looked at the window. "Ava." He used her name deliberately, the way she used his, as a fact, not a formality. What do you want to do? She turned back to him. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been asked a question they have spent a long time avoiding. What I want to do, she said slowly, is close this deal on December 28th, get through the surgery in January, and not give Richard Holloway the satisfaction of watching anything fall apart. She held his gaze. What I'm worried about is that he moves before January. If he has 5 votes and he calls an emergency session, he can put a motion of no confidence on the table. She paused. He would need a reason, something documented, something that makes the case for incapacity. Another pause. A cancer diagnosis would do it. Lucas sat with that for a second. He was not a person who made noise when he was thinking. He had found over months of working near Ava that she appreciated this more than most qualities he possessed. The ability to sit with something real and not immediately try to smooth it over. He won't get the chance, Lucas said finally. She looked at him. You don't know that. No, he said, but he won't get it from me, and you have until January 14th to get through the surgery and come back stronger, and I will spend every hour between now and then making sure the numbers, the projections, the documentation, and every piece of analysis Holloway could try to use against you is airtight. He held her gaze. You're not going to lose this company. Not to him. She stared at him for a long moment. Lucas, she said carefully, that is more than your job description. I know. Why? It was a direct question. It deserved a direct answer. He thought about giving her a clean professional reason, something about the work, something about the deal. He had the words ready. They were good words, plausible words, words that would keep everything in its lane. He said none of them. Because you matter, he said. What you've built matters. And because Holloway is wrong and wrong people winning is one of the things in this world I can't make my peace with. She looked at him for what felt like a very long time. The office was completely quiet. Outside, the city hummed its constant, indifferent note. Okay, she said finally. Her voice was slightly different than its usual register, softer by barely a measurable amount. Then let's not let him win. December moved fast the way it always does when there's too much to do. Lucas worked. He had always worked hard, but there was a quality to this stretch of work that was different from anything he'd done before. A focus that felt almost physical, like something he was pressing against with his whole weight. He refined projections, rebuilt assumptions, rebuilt them again. He caught 2 errors in the due diligence documentation that could have created complications post-close. He flagged them to Ava. She addressed them, and neither of them made anything of it. They ate dinner together in her office 3 times in the first 2 weeks of December. Not by design it happened because they were both there late, and someone had ordered food, and the conversation about work continued naturally while they ate. The first time it happened, Lucas was aware of a low-level alertness in him, a consciousness of proximity that he carefully managed. The second time it was easier. The third time he forgot to manage it at all and just ate his food and talked with her and noticed somewhere around 9 o'clock that he was more comfortable in that chair across from her desk than he was on his own couch. She was funny. That was the thing that consistently surprised him. The thing he could not have predicted from the boardroom version of her. Not funny in a performed way, not the sharp defensive humor people use as a weapon. She was funny in the way people are when they have a precise enough read on the world to notice exactly where it's being absurd. She made 2 remarks over the course of those evenings that made him laugh genuinely and voluntarily, in a way he realized he hadn't laughed in considerably longer than 14 months. She noticed. He could tell by the way she looked at him after the second time, not smug, not even pleased exactly. Just watching him with an expression like someone cataloging something unexpected. She was also tired. He could see that too underneath everything else, in the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence for just a half beat longer than was natural, or in the way she moved from her chair to the window and back with the particular carefulness of someone whose body is requiring more attention than usual. She never mentioned the treatment. He never asked, but it was there between them, the way the most important things often are completely present, never spoken, changing the temperature of every moment it inhabited. Holloway made his move on December 19th. Philip Wren called Lucas at 8:15 in the morning, which was unusual enough to be alarming before he even answered. Philip's voice was controlled, but operating at a frequency that told Lucas something had already happened by the time he picked up. I need you in the building, Philip said. Now, don't talk to anyone on your way up. Lucas was there in 22 minutes. The situation, as Philip laid it out in the hallway outside his office with the door firmly shut behind them, was this: Holloway had submitted a formal request for an emergency board session, citing a document. Philip's voice tightened slightly. Here, a document that appeared to contain medical information related to the company's chief executive. The session was being requested for December 23rd. The ground being cited was fiduciary responsibility and material undisclosed risk. Lucas kept his face completely still. Who submitted the document? Philip hesitated. It came through a third-party source. We're looking into that. Does Ava know? I'm going to her in 20 minutes. I wanted to speak to you first because... Philip stopped, chose his words. Because I know you've been working closely with her, and I think she's going to need people around her right now who understand the actual situation. Lucas nodded. I understand the actual situation. He went with Philip. The meeting with Ava lasted 4 minutes before Ava stood up and said with a precision that left no room for interpretation, I need 5 minutes. Philip nodded and stepped out. Lucas moved to follow, and Ava said without turning around, Not you. He stopped. She stood at the window with her back to him for those 5 minutes. He did not speak. He did not look away. He stood in the room and was present in the way he had learned she needed, not filling the silence, not rushing toward it, just there. When she turned around, her eyes were dry and her expression was absolutely composed, and he was close enough to her now in every sense that mattered to know what that composure was built on top of. He got the information from my oncologist's billing department, she said. It wasn't a question. Someone pulled insurance records. That's the only way he could have it documented. That's illegal, Lucas said. Yes, she said it without satisfaction. Which means the document itself may be inadmissible in a formal governance proceeding. But the damage, she stopped. The damage is that the board now knows whether the session happens or not. What do you want to do? She looked at him. It was the third time he'd asked her that question in this particular way, and by now they both understood that the question was not a deflection. It was the most honest thing he could offer her, the recognition that the decision was hers, and that he was not going to take it from her by telling her what he would do if he were her. I'm going to call the session myself, she said. Lucas stared at her. Before Richard can. I'm going to call an emergency board meeting for December 21st, and I'm going to tell them everything myself. My diagnosis, my treatment timeline, the surgery, the prognosis. She held his gaze steadily. And I'm going to show them every piece of analysis we've put together proving that this company is not only secure through my treatment, but stronger on every measurable metric than it's been in 4 years. He stopped. Risky, she finished. I know it's risky, but Richard's leverage is the secrecy. If there's no secret, there's no leverage. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes were absolutely clear. He wanted to use this to surprise me. I'm not going to let him. Lucas looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had built an empire with her hands and her mind, and the sheer refusal to let the world's assessment of her become true. At the woman who pressed her palm against the wall in empty hallways and said every single day yes to the question of whether she was scared, and then walked back out into the world and ran a billion-dollar company with the same hands that were shaking. The analysis is ready, he said, all of it. I'll have the full package on your desk in 2 hours. She nodded. And then in a moment that he would replay many times afterwards, she said something that was not about the board or the deal or Holloway or any of it. You've been here, she said quietly, for months. You've been here in a way that nobody else has. She stopped like she hadn't planned to say that and was now deciding how far to go. I want you to know that I'm aware of it. He didn't say it was nothing. He didn't deflect. I know you're aware of it, he said. You're aware of everything. Something crossed her face, complicated and quick and real. She turned back to her desk. 2 hours, she said. The board meeting on December 21st lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Lucas was not in the room. He was on the 14th floor, his laptop waiting in the specific way that you wait for something when you have done everything you can do and the rest is entirely out of your hands. He got Philip's text at 11:47. She held it. He sat there for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he texted back how Philip's response came 30 seconds later. She walked in there and told them everything before Richard could open his mouth, showed them 3 years of performance data, explained the treatment timeline, the surgical plan, the recovery projection, answered every question cold. Richard tried twice to redirect and she cut him off both times. A pause, then 4 board members shook her hand afterward. Richard left before the session formally closed. Lucas set his phone down on his desk. He pressed his hands flat against the surface and breathed. He had known she was capable of it. He had known it in the abstract, professional, admiring way that you know things about people you work with. But knowing it and receiving the confirmation of it at 11:47 on a December morning were 2 entirely different things. He sat there for a long time. When she appeared in the doorway of the analyst's floor 40 minutes later, he was the only one at his desk. She had her coat on, which meant she was leaving something she rarely did before 6. "The deal closes on the 28th, she said from the doorway. "Everything you built held." "I know," he said. She looked at him across the distance of the empty floor. "Thank you," she said. 2 words the same way she said "good work," without inflation, without performance. Just the clean, honest weight of it. He looked back at her. "You did that?" he said. "In there you did that. I just made sure the math was right." She held his gaze for one moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Then she said, "Go home, Lucas." And she was gone. He went home. He sat on his couch in his quiet apartment and didn't turn on the lights for a while. He sat in the dark and thought about December 21st and December 28th and January 14th and the distance between them and the woman who was going to have to cross all of it. He thought about how he was going to feel on January 14th. He already knew the answer. He had known it for weeks. The knowing of it had been sitting in him like a stone he kept walking around, and tonight for the first time he stopped walking around it and just looked at it directly. He was in love with her. He had no idea what to do with that. She was his boss. She was sick. She was the most self-sufficient person he had ever met, and the one most likely to regard the information as an inconvenience. She had asked for a partner in confidentiality, not a man who had somewhere between November and December stopped being able to imagine his life without her in it. He sat with all of that for a long time. Then he got up, went to his kitchen, made himself something to eat, and decided that January 14th was what mattered right now and that everything else would have to wait. The Meridian deal closed on December 28th, 2 hours ahead of schedule. Lucas got the confirmation on his phone while he was standing in line at a coffee shop. He stood there and read the message twice and felt a particular quiet satisfaction settle in his chest, the kind that comes not from personal victory, but from watching something built right come out the way it was supposed to. He texted Ava congratulations. She texted back 17 minutes later. "We both know you had something to do with it." He smiled at his phone in a coffee shop on a Tuesday and did not care that it was slightly embarrassing. January moved the way months move when you're waiting for something. Lucas was in the building. The work continued. He and Ava passed each other in the ways they always had in the spaces where their work intersected, and there was something between them now that had no name and required no name, a current that was simply there, that both of them moved through and around without addressing, without retreating from. She told him 2 days before the surgery. She knocked on the door of the small conference room where he was working, which was unusual enough that he looked up immediately. "January 14th, she said. 7 a.m. check-in. I should be out of surgery by early afternoon." He nodded. "What do you need from me?" She seemed to consider this question more carefully than it might have warranted. "I need you to not treat everything differently when I come back," she said. "I need the work to be normal. I need you to treat me like you always have." "I can do that." "You're going to want to be careful with me," she said. "Everyone will. I need you to not be." He looked at her steadily. "Ava, I've never been careful with you." She held his gaze. And for just a second, a fragment of a second something in her gaze opened in a way he had not seen before, something unguarded and completely real, before she put it back. "No," she said quietly. "You haven't." She straightened. "I'll be in touch when I'm out." She turned and walked away. He watched her go, and he thought January 14th. And he thought she is about to go through the hardest thing, and she will go through it alone, and there is nothing I can do about that. He was wrong about the last part. He just didn't know it yet. He was in the hospital waiting room at 6:45 in the morning. He hadn't planned it. That was what he told himself on the drive over, and it was almost true. He had woken at 5 Lane in the dark for 30 minutes, and then gotten up and put on his coat and driven to St. Carmichael Medical Center. Because the alternative, sitting in his apartment, knowing what was happening across the city and doing nothing about it, was something his body simply refused to allow. He didn't text her. He didn't call. He sat in a chair in the surgical waiting area on the third floor with a paper cup of coffee that went cold in his hands, and he waited. The surgery was scheduled to take between 3 and 5 hours, depending on what they found once they were in. He knew this because he had quietly, carefully researched what a stage 2 mastectomy with reconstruction involved in the same methodical way he approached any information gap he needed to close. He had read 3 medical journal summaries and 2 patient advocacy guides, and he had sat with all of it in his chest for 4 days without saying a word to anyone. He was on his second cold coffee when his phone buzzed at 8:19 with a text from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "She listed you as her emergency contact. Are you in the building?" He stared at the message for 1 full second. Then he stood up. The nurse who had texted him was a young woman named Carla, who met him at the third-floor nursing station with the brisk efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that medical situations don't wait for people to emotionally catch up. She told him Ava had listed him 2 weeks ago when completing her pre-surgical paperwork. She told him this as if it were an ordinary fact, and Lucas received it the same way, because the alternative was to stand in the middle of a hospital hallway and process what it meant that Ava Sinclair, who had no one, who carried everything alone, who had pressed her palm against a wall in an empty hallway rather than let anyone see her struggling, had written his name on that line. "She's in surgery," Carla said. "Expected out by early afternoon. Is there anything you need?" "No," he said. "I'll wait." He waited. He answered 3 work emails with the focused detachment of a man who has learned to partition his mind under pressure. He called Philip at 9:30 to say he'd be working remotely for the morning, giving no reason, and Philip said, "Of course," in a tone that suggested he knew more than he was saying. He ate half a granola bar he found in his coat pocket. He sat. At 12:47, Carla appeared again. "She's out," she said. "Surgery went well. The margins were clear." She paused, and in that pause, Lucas felt his entire chest release something it had been holding for 4 hours. "She's in recovery. She'll be asking for her phone within about 20 minutes of waking up, so if you want to be there when she does." "Yes," he said before she'd finished the sentence. Ava was awake when he came in. Not fully, she was in that half-lit territory between the anesthesia and the surface. Her eyes open, but not yet all the way tracking. She looked smaller than she did in any context he had ever seen her, and the sight of her like that hit him somewhere that had nothing to do with professional regard. He pulled the chair close and sat down. She turned her head and found his face and looked at him for a long moment. "You're here," she said. Her voice was rough and slow from the anesthesia, nothing like its usual precision. "I'm here," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said quietly, "Why?" He thought about every version of the answer he could give her. The honest one, the careful one, the one that kept everything manageable and professional and safe. He thought about all of them. "Because I didn't want you to wake up alone," he said. She held his gaze and said nothing. Her expression was completely open, in the way that people's expressions sometimes are in that narrow window, just after anesthesia, before the managed self comes fully back online. She looked like herself, but without the armor, and what was underneath the armor was not weakness. It was just Ava, unfiltered, seeing him clearly. "I listed you," she said. "I know. I wasn't sure you'd come." "I came," he said. "Go back to sleep. I'll be here." She looked at him for one more moment, and then she closed her eyes. He stayed for 4 hours. She slept for most of them. When she woke again, she was more herself, alert, dry, slightly annoyed at the IV line, and immediately asking about her phone. He handed it to her. She read 12 messages in 3 minutes, responded to 2 of them, and then looked at him with an expression that was clearly her trying to reconstruct her composure after the rawness of waking up. "The surgery went well," she said. "Carla told me. Clear margins." "Yes." She set the phone down. "You should probably get back to—" "I'm working remotely today," he said. "I already told Philip." She looked at him. "Lucas?" A beat of silence. She looked at the phone in her hands. Then she said in a voice that was almost back to its normal register, but not quite, "You don't have to stay." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's the whole point." She looked at him. And again, that opening in her face, the one that lasted just a second before she pulled it back. But this time, she didn't pull it all the way back. She left a small amount of it visible, And that was how he knew this was real, all of it, every piece of it. I hate hospitals, she said finally. Most people do. I've spent too much time in them. She paused. Not as a patient. My mother was sick for a long time. I spent 3 years in and out of rooms like this before I was 20. She stopped like she'd just noticed she was saying something she hadn't planned to say. I swore I'd never be on that side of it. It was the most personal thing she had ever told him. More personal than the cancer diagnosis which she had delivered with clinical precision. This was something older, something that lived deeper. I'm sorry, he said. About your mother. She nodded, looked at her phone, looked at him. She would have thought you were ridiculous for sitting in a waiting room for 4 hours. Would she have been wrong? Something that was almost a smile. No, she said quietly. She would not have been wrong. She looked at him for a moment longer. She also would have liked you. He let that sit there, let it be what it was. She was discharged 3 days later. She went home to her apartment, which Lucas had never been inside. He knew where it was, 42nd floor of a building downtown, and he knew nothing else about it, which felt strange, given how much else he knew about her. He imagined it as something like her office, functional, precise, containing exactly what was necessary and nothing for decoration. He texted her twice in the first week of her recovery. Specific practical text was she getting the follow-up report she'd asked Philip to route to her and had the operations team sent the Q1 projections yet. She responded to both with equal practicality. He kept it at that. He had promised her normal, and normal was what he gave her, even though nothing about the situation was normal, and they both knew it. Holloway broke the quiet first. It was a Thursday evening, 8 days after Ava's surgery, when Philip Wren appeared at Lucas's desk with an expression that meant something had happened that Philip did not want to be the one delivering. Richard sent a communication to the board this afternoon, Philip said. He held out his phone. I think you should read it. Lucas read it. It was 4 paragraphs. Precise, legalistic, constructed with the care of someone who had spent significant time and probably significant legal fees on each sentence. It formally requested the board to consider whether Ava Sinclair's medical condition constituted a material change in her capacity to serve as chief executive, and whether a temporary transfer of executive authority was warranted during her recovery period. It cited a specific provision of the company's governance charter. It was dated the same day as her discharge from the hospital. Lucas read it twice, then he set the phone on his desk. He timed this for while she's recovering, he said. Yes. He waited until she was out of the building. Yes. Lucas looked at Philip. What does she know? She received the same communication. About 10 minutes before I came to you. Philip paused. She called me immediately. He searched for the word. She was not upset in the way you might expect. She sounded like herself. He paused again, which honestly worried me more. Lucas was already picking up his phone. She answered on the second ring. I saw it, he said. I know you did. Her voice was exactly what Philip had described, entirely herself, precise and even, and giving away nothing. Philip moves fast. What are you doing right now? A brief pause. Reading the governance charter. Ava, don't say it. I'm coming over. A longer pause. I know what you need and what you don't need, he said. I'm coming over. Tell me your address, she told him. She answered the door in a sweatshirt and no reading glasses, which meant she'd left them on whatever surface she'd been working at, and the apartment behind her was exactly and precisely what he'd imagined. Clean, considered everything in its place, and almost nothing on the walls except one framed photograph. He clocked from the doorway without being able to see what it was. She stepped back and let him in without comment. She had the governance charter open on her laptop and a yellow legal pad beside it with notes in her handwriting, small, angular, nothing like her signature, which she'd told him once she'd developed specifically for professional use. He sat across from her and read what she'd annotated, and they talked about it for an hour. Not around it, not about feelings, about the actual document, the actual provision Holloway had cited, and the actual argument they needed to construct to defeat it. She was sharper than he'd expected, given that she was 8 days out of surgery. She was sharper than most people he'd ever worked with in any condition. The provision requires demonstrable incapacity, she said. Not diagnosis, not treatment, actual demonstrated inability to perform executive functions. She turned the legal pad toward him. I've been available to the business every day since I left the hospital. Documented. She tapped the pad. Response times, decisions logged. Philip has the records. Then we build the counter on documented function, Lucas said. Day by day. Everything you have touched since the discharge date with timestamps. Exactly. She pulled the laptop back. I want to respond to the board by Monday. I need the functional record, the governance argument, and the performance data from Q4. All of it together. I'll have everything ready by Sunday night. She looked at him. It's Thursday. I know. Another look. Then she nodded and went back to the laptop. They worked for 3 hours. He sat across from her at her kitchen table, and they built the counter argument piece by piece. And at some point, she made coffee without asking if he wanted any and set a cup beside his elbow. And he noticed that she took hers the same way he did, black. No ceremony. And he noticed this, the way you notice things about people you are trying very hard not to be in love with. It was close to 11 when he finally closed his laptop. Go sleep, he said. I'm fine. You're 8 days out of surgery. I'm aware of what I'm 8 days out of, she said. But she closed the laptop. He stood up and put on his coat, and she walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment in the specific quiet of a late evening that is about to end. He was almost in the hallway when she said his name. Lucas. He turned. She was leaning against the door frame. Not her boardroom posture, not her operational mode, just standing in her sweatshirt with the apartment light behind her. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before and could not immediately name. Why are you doing this? She asked. Not the way she'd asked in the hospital, soft and anesthesia blurred. This was a real question, a full capacity question from the full capacity version of her, and it deserved the full capacity answer. You know why, he said. She held his gaze. I want you to say it. He had been standing on the edge of this for months. He had been patient with it, had managed, it had carried it on the side of his chest like a thing he kept meaning to set down and never did. And standing in her doorway on a January night with the documents open on her table and her 8 days recovered and Holloway circling and all of it pressing in from every direction, he decided that the edge was where he was done standing. Because you matter to me, he said, not professionally, not as a colleague. You matter to me, Ava, in the way that changes what normal feels like. And I've been trying not to say that because of about 15 completely reasonable reasons, and tonight I'm done trying. The silence that followed was the most complete silence he could remember standing inside. She looked at him. Her expression moved through several somethings, and he watched it happen without trying to read ahead. He let her arrive at whatever she arrived at on her own time. Lucas, she said, her voice was different now, lower, quieter, without its operational edge. I don't know how to... She stopped, started again. I've been alone for a very long time. By choice, because it was easier and because the alternative... Another stop. I don't do this well, whatever this is. Neither do I, he said. I was married for 6 years to someone I loved and still managed to build a life she couldn't live in. I don't have a good track record with this either. She looked at him. Then what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, he said. I'm just telling you the truth. What you do with it is your call. She was quiet for a long moment. Come back on Sunday, she said finally, with the documents. Okay. And Lucas. She said his name with a precision that landed differently than it ever had before. I heard you. He nodded. He went to the elevator. He pressed the button and waited and did not look back because he knew she was still in the doorway, and he knew that if he looked back, he would not be able to leave. The elevator came. He stepped in. On the ride down, he stood very still and let himself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had heard him. Sunday came with the documents and 4 hours of work at her kitchen table and coffee and the particular focused quiet of two people who have said something true to each other and are now operating in the new landscape that truth has made. It was easier than he'd expected and harder than he'd expected, and both of those things at once, which he'd read somewhere, was the definition of something real. He submitted the counter-argument to the board on Monday morning with Philip's cover letter attached. It was thorough, documented, and airtight. By Monday afternoon, 3 board members had responded individually, not to the group, but to Ava, directly indicating that they found Holloway's motion without merit. By Tuesday, a 4th had written. Holloway's motion died without a formal vote. Philip called Lucas on Wednesday afternoon. She held it again, he said. And then he said with the careful neutrality of a man who is not going to ask questions he's decided are none of his business. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Lucas was at his desk when Ava texted him that afternoon. It was brief, which was how all her texts were. It said, motion dropped. Richard has officially run out of road. He texted back, good. She responded, thank you. And then after a pause of several minutes, for all of it. He sat with his phone in his hand and felt something settle in his chest, not triumphant, not even satisfied exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like the very first day of something instead of the last. 2 weeks later, she was back in the building. She walked onto the floor at 8:15 on a Monday morning like she had never left coat and reading glasses pushed up on her headphone in hand. People looked up. A few people started to say something and then clearly changed their minds, which was the right choice. She walked through the floor with her usual stride and her usual expression and went to her office and closed the door. Lucas didn't see her until 11:30 when she appeared in the doorway of the conference room where he was working and said, walk with me. They walked to the small kitchen on the 14th floor, which was where this had started, which neither of them mentioned. She poured herself coffee without asking, and he did the same, and they stood there. And she said, Philip briefed me on where everything is. You kept it running. The team kept it running, he said. You kept it running, she said again with a finality that closed the argument. She looked at her cup, then at him. I want to move the Q1 projections up a week. I want to get ahead of the narrative before anyone can wonder whether I'm back to full capacity. She paused. I need you on that. Already started, he said. She looked at him. And something in her face did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency since January, that opening that brief visible realness beneath everything else. I know, she said. You always are. They stood in the kitchen with their coffee and the ordinary hum of the building around them, and it was the most comfortable silence Lucas had stood inside in years, maybe longer, and he thought, this is what I didn't know I was missing. Not the absence of difficulty, not the absence of fear, but someone to stand in it with. He was still thinking that when she set down her cup, picked up her phone and said almost as an afterthought, have dinner with me tonight. He looked at her. Not a working dinner. The way she said it made clear it was not a working dinner. Okay, he said. She nodded, walked out. He stayed in the kitchen for another 30 seconds and drank his coffee and felt the shape of things shifting, all of it moving towards something he didn't have a name for yet, but that he was no longer afraid to walk toward. He did not know that the thing without a name was only 3 weeks away. He did not know that she was already carrying the question she was going to ask him. He did not know that when she finally asked it, standing in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and winter air, barely 48 hours after a follow-up procedure had found something else they needed to address, he did not know that the question would be 4 words. 4 words that would rewrite everything. He just stood in the kitchen on the 14th floor and finished his coffee and thought about dinner and thought about Ava and thought about the way already started had made her look at him. And he allowed himself for the first time to believe that maybe what he'd started wasn't just a calculation or a document or a piece of work that would eventually be finished. Maybe what he'd started was a life. Dinner was not what he expected. He had built a version of it in his head on the drive over, something careful, something that would feel like a first step being taken deliberately. He imagined she would choose somewhere quiet, professional, in atmosphere, if not in purpose, the kind of place where the lighting is low enough to make things personal, but the tables are far enough apart to make things manageable. She texted him an address that turned out to be a Thai restaurant, 12 blocks from the office, with plastic menus and a handwritten specials board, and absolutely no ambiance whatsoever. And when he walked in, she was already seated at a table in the back with a water glass and her reading glasses on, looking at the menu like it was a document requiring analysis. She looked up when he sat down. I've been coming here for 4 years, she said. They don't know who I am. I like that. He understood immediately. What's good? Everything with the green curry base. She set the menu down. The pad CW is better than it has any right to be. They ordered. They talked. And what struck him sitting across from her in that ordinary restaurant with the ordinary noise of other people's conversations around them was how different it felt from every other time they had talked. Not worse, not more awkward, different in the way that altitude changes when you cross a certain line. They had crossed a line on her doorstep 3 weeks ago, and on the other side of it, Ava Sinclair talked like a person who had put down something heavy. She told him about Tennessee, not the broad strokes he already knew, but the texture of it, the specific small town, the house with its bad heating, her mother's kitchen, which was the warmest room, not because of any appliance, but because her mother was always in it. She told him about the nursing program and the professor who had looked at her first clinical assessment and said flatly that she was the most analytically precise student he'd had in 9 years. She told him that was the first time she'd understood that her brain was not a liability. People kept telling me growing up that I thought too much, she said. My teachers, boys I knew, my aunt. She picked up her glass. Too intense, too serious, too much. And now people call it visionary, Lucas said. She looked at him, and now people call it threatening and use it to try to vote me out of my own company. A pause. But yes, some of them call it visionary. He smiled. She almost did. What about you? She said. It wasn't quite a question. She'd been doing that lately, making questions into statements like she was offering him the space to answer without demanding he take it. He told her about growing up in Ohio, about his father who worked at the plant for 30 years and died believing Lucas's MBA was some kind of elaborate joke the universe was playing on the family. About Elena, honestly and without bitterness, the way they had been good together for a while and then gradually become two people maintaining the appearance of something that had quietly stopped existing. He hadn't talked about his marriage to anyone with this much honesty. The divorce had been a fact he reported to people, not a thing he examined. Do you regret it? She asked. The marriage? He thought about it. I regret that we waited too long to be honest, he said. I don't regret the 6 years. She's a good person. I'm a different person than I was when I met her, and she needed someone who was going to stay the same. He paused. I don't think I was ever going to stay the same. Ava looked at him for a moment. No, she said quietly. You're not. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. They stayed 2 hours. On the sidewalk outside, she said she was going to walk home, which was 8 blocks, and he fell into step beside her without asking. And she let him, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had technically asked. They walked slowly. She talked about the Q1 projections. He talked about a methodology issue he had been turning over. They solved it on the sidewalk, talking it through as they walked, and when they reached her building, she stopped and turned toward him and said with the precision that was uniquely hers, this was good. It was, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Same time next week. He held her gaze. Same time next week. She went inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and then walked the 8 blocks back to his car, and the whole way there he felt something he recognized from very long ago, the particular lightness of a life that has more in it than it did this morning. The next 3 weeks moved fast and well. They had dinner twice more, the Thai place again, and then a quiet Italian restaurant she chose with the same criteria no one would know her, the food would be real, and there would be no performance required. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped pretending they are only one thing to each other. She asked him real questions, and he gave her real answers, and she did the same in return, and every time she did it, Lucas had the feeling of watching something rare and careful, being decided, a trust being extended one increment at a time by a person for whom trust was a limited and precious resource. At the office, they were professional, clean, precise, appropriate. They had always been good at that, and they remained good at it, and he appreciated that she required it not because she was ashamed of whatever was happening between them, but because she was a person who kept things in their compartments. And there was something clarifying about being with someone who understood that professional and personal could coexist without contaminating each other. Holloway had gone quiet. The board motion's failure and its aftermath had apparently settled something, though Lucas did not trust the silence the way he would have trusted a genuine resolution. Quiet from Richard Holloway felt less like peace and more like something regrouping. Philip said as much in a conversation with Lucas in the hallway in late January. He hasn't left, Philip said. He still has 4 board votes. He's waiting for something. A pause. I don't know what. Lucas filed it and kept working. The follow-up scan was scheduled for the first week of February. Ava had mentioned it exactly once, in a text that said, follow-up imaging February 3rd, should have preliminary results by the 5th. He had responded, "I'll be available." She had not responded to that, but she hadn't pushed back either, which from Ava was equivalent to a yes. The fifth came on a Thursday. He was at his desk at 2:15 when his phone buzzed with her name and a single sentence, "Can you come to St. Carmichael? Room 412." He was on his feet before he'd finished reading it. He told no one. He closed his laptop, put on his coat, and walked to the elevator with the focused calm of a person who has decided that whatever he is walking toward, he is not going to walk toward it in pieces. Room 412 was a private room on the fourth floor. The door was halfway open. He knocked once and pushed it, and she was sitting up in the bed, not lying down. Sitting up, which was so completely her that it almost made him laugh, with her phone in her hand and her reading glasses on, and an expression on her face that he had never seen before. Not afraid. Not the controlled fear he'd heard in her voice on the Thursday in November when she'd told him. This was something different. This was the face of someone who has just received information that has changed the shape of the room they're standing in. "What happened?" he said, not a question. He closed the door and came to the chair beside the bed and sat down and looked at her. She set the phone on the blanket. She looked at him. "The imaging came back," she said. "They found a secondary lesion." She paused. "Right clavicular lymph nodes. It's small. The oncologist says they caught it early, significantly earlier than the primary, and the prognosis with targeted treatment is very good." Another pause. "But it means another round. More targeted this time, and they want to start within 2 weeks." He held her gaze and let the information arrive and settle. He did not say it would be okay. He had learned by now that okay was not the word she needed, and that the people who said it fastest were usually saying it for themselves. "How long is the treatment cycle?" he said. 6 to 8 weeks of targeted radiation, possibly combined with a modified hormone therapy. She said this with the same clinical precision she used for everything, but her hands were in her lap and her fingers were pressed together, and he could see the effort of the steadiness. "And functioning. Can you work through it?" "The oncologist says most patients with this protocol maintain fairly normal activity levels." A beat. I told her normal was non-negotiable. Of course she had. "Then you'll maintain normal activity levels," he said. "We adjust whatever we need to adjust. The Q1 close is in 3 weeks, that's fine. It'll be done before treatment starts. The 2 projections I can carry for as long as needed." She looked at him for a long moment. "Lucas," she said. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't tell me it's too much." He held her gaze. "We already had this conversation. The version where you tell me I don't have to do this, and I tell you that I know and I'm doing it anyway. We've had it enough times that I think we can skip it." She stared at him, and then something happened that he had seen only twice before, the real unmanaged version of her face, the one that existed underneath all of it. She pressed her lips together and looked at the blanket, and when she looked back at him, her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was fully visible. "I'm tired," she said. It was perhaps the most honest sentence she had ever spoken. Not about sleep, not about the physical, about the weight of it, the months of it, the managing and the caring and the showing up every single day as something formidable when inside she was a person fighting a war most of her world didn't know she was fighting. He reached across and put his hand over hers. She looked down at it. She didn't move. She didn't pull away. She sat there with his hand covering hers and breathed. "I know," he said. They sat like that for a moment that had no defined length. Outside the door, the hospital moved through its ordinary rhythms, and inside the room, it was just the two of them, and the truth of the situation, and it was difficult, and it was real, and it was the most present he had felt in years. Then she said quietly without looking up, "Be my husband." The room went completely still. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He wasn't sure he breathed. She raised her head and looked at him directly. Her gaze was completely steady, not fragile, not uncertain. The same gaze she used in board meetings and strategy sessions and every other moment when something mattered and she needed to be honest about what she wanted. "I'm not asking because I'm scared," she said. "I'm asking because I know what I need, and I've spent my whole life not letting myself say it." She paused. "I need someone who is going to choose me, not feel sorry for me, not stay out of obligation. Choose me, all of it, the diagnosis, the company, the woman who doesn't know how to ask for things and has to do it in a hospital room because apparently that's the only place I can get out of my own way." She stopped, held his gaze. I know what I'm asking. I know how it sounds. And I know your history, and I am not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking you to be exactly what you've been for the last 4 months, but all the way. Lucas Bennett was not a man who did not know what he felt. He had spent 14 months after his divorce learning very clearly what it felt like to be in a life that was not quite right. And he had come to understand that the inverse of that, a life that was right, was something he would recognize if he ever encountered it. He had been recognizing it since November. He looked at her, at the woman who had built an empire in Beaton Holloway and called a board meeting about her own cancer and pressed her hand against a wall in an empty hallway and made him coffee and walked next to him for 8 blocks, talking about methodology and ordered pad CUW at a plastic menu restaurant because she needed one place in the world where nobody knew her. Yes, he said. She blinked. Yes, he said again because it deserved to be said twice. Not because you're sick, not because I feel sorry for you. I've never felt sorry for you a single day because you're the person I want to be in a life with, because you're the only person in a very long time who has made what comes next feel like something worth building instead of something to get through. He held her gaze steadily. So yes, Ava, I will be your husband. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. That one had been shock. This one was something being made. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw moved slightly the way it did when she was containing something large. I should tell you, she said carefully, that I am a genuinely difficult person. I know. I work too much. I have opinions about methodology at 11 o'clock at night. I have never in my adult life asked anyone for help without it feeling like it cost me something significant. I know all of that, he said. I've known it for months. It didn't slow me down then, and it's not slowing me down now. She looked at him, and then finally, fully, without pulling it back, she let the smile happen. Not a polished smile, not the professional one. The real one, the one that changed her face entirely and made her look like the woman from Tennessee who had been told she thought too much and had decided to think even more, the woman who had built everything from the ground up with her hands and her mind, and her stubborn refusal to be what other people needed her to be. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat in the hospital room in the February afternoon and looked at each other, and it was not romantic in any conventional way. There were no candles, no ceremony, no music, just fluorescent light in a blanket, and 2 people who had found each other in the middle of everything being difficult and had decided to stop finding reasons not to stay. He had one question. He asked it simply. When you listed me as your emergency contact in January before the surgery, he looked at her. You already knew then. She held his gaze for a moment. I knew then that I wanted to, she said. I didn't know yet that I was going to. A pause. You have to understand wanting something and letting myself have it are not the same thing for me. They have never been the same thing. I understand, he said. I know you do, she said quietly. That's part of why I'm asking. They were still sitting there, his hand still over hers, when Carla knocked and opened the door and stopped in the doorway when she registered the room's atmosphere. I can come back, Carla said. It's fine, Ava said. Her voice was back to its normal register, but there was something underneath it now, a warmth that Carla clearly noticed, because she looked between them with an expression she immediately made professional again. Carla came in, checked the IV site, said something about the attending, wanting to speak with Ava before discharge in the morning, and left with the tactful efficiency of a person who understands when they've walked into something that isn't her business. When the door closed again, Ava looked at Lucas and said with perfect composure, and the small private smile that was becoming something he collected, she's going to tell everyone on the floor. Probably, he said. I don't care, she said. And the way she said it, he could tell she was slightly surprised by the truth of it. He stayed until 8. She ate the hospital food with her reading glasses on and read 3 work documents on her phone and argued with him mildly about the Q2 projection methodology. And it was so completely ordinary and so completely extraordinary that he had to concentrate to follow the argument. When he stood to leave, she said his name the way she always said it, as a fact. Lucas? He turned. Thank you for coming, she said. Today and all of it. You don't have to thank me. I want to, she said. I'm practicing. A beat. Wanting things and letting myself say them. He looked at her. You're very good at it. he said. Keep going. He walked out into the hallway and pressed the elevator button and stood there thinking about the 4 words she had said and the 1 word he had said back and the way those 5 words had rearranged the furniture of his life so completely that he could not remember what the room had looked like before them. He drove home. He sat in his apartment, which was the same apartment it had always been. Same walls, same furniture, same specific quiet, and it felt different from the inside. Like the same space with a different quality of air. He understood what had changed. It wasn't the room, it was the person standing in it. He had said yes in a hospital room to a woman who had asked him in the most unromantic and completely perfect way possible, and there was no part of him that needed to think about it again, or question it, or run the numbers to verify the outcome. He had done enough of that already. For months he had run the numbers on this situation, and the numbers always came out the same. She was the person and this was the life, and what remained was simply to be honest enough to say so. He was. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, sitting in their separate parts of the city that February night, was what was still coming. The treatment, the weeks ahead, the moment Holloway would make one final move and the board would hold an emergency session that Ava did not walk into alone. The morning Philip would call Lucas to say something had happened and Lucas would already be on his way. The conversation that would happen on a day in late March when everything Holloway had tried to destroy would come back to him in a way he had not anticipated, and Ava would be the one sitting at the head of the table when it did. And there was something else neither of them knew yet, something Ava's oncologist would tell her in the 3rd week of treatment, something that would stop the conversation in a way that required a full minute of recalibration from both of them, something that changed the word family from an abstract noun to a concrete question. But that night in his apartment, Lucas Bennett sat in the quiet and felt something he hadn't felt in long enough, that recognizing it took him a moment. It felt like forward. He texted her at 10:15. Good night, sleep if you can. She responded at 10:22. Working on the Q2 variants. I found an error in section 3. He stared at the message. Then he laughed a real involuntary laugh in his empty apartment that sounded like relief. He typed back, I'll fix it in the morning. She sent back, I already fixed it. Of course she had. He set his phone down and looked at the ceiling and felt the forward-moving things settle in his chest like something that had found its place. And he thought about the woman in room 412 who had asked him 4 words in a hospital room and meant every single one of them with the same absolute precision she brought to everything she did. And he thought, I am going to spend a very long time not being able to imagine what came before this. And he was right. Treatment started on a Monday. Ava told him this the night before with the same tone she used to tell him about board meetings, factual, precise, forward-facing. She was sitting across from him at the Thai restaurant because she had insisted they keep their standing dinner. And she said, first session tomorrow at 8. The oncologist says the fatigue builds cumulatively, so the first 2 weeks may feel deceptively manageable. She picked up her fork. I want to set expectations with you clearly so you don't adjust your behavior based on a false read of how I'm doing. He looked at her. What would adjusting my behavior look like? Treating me like I'm breakable. Have I done that yet? She considered. No. Then you don't need to set expectations, he said. Just tell me when something's different and I'll respond to what's actually happening instead of what I'm anticipating. She looked at him across the table for a moment. Then she picked up her glass. That's a reasonable system, she said. Thank you, he said. I worked on it. She didn't smile, but her eyes did something that counted as the same thing. The first 2 weeks were, as her oncologist predicted, deceptively manageable. She went to treatment at 8, was at her desk by 11, and worked until 7 with a precision that made Philip quietly stop worrying and start simply admiring. Lucas watched her from the appropriate professional distance they maintained in the building and said nothing beyond what the work required. But he texted her every morning at 6:50, not asking how she felt, never that, because she would have found it smothering just one sentence about whatever they were working on that day. A question, an observation, something that meant, I'm here and we're moving forward, and nothing about today has to be about what you're fighting. She always responded within 4 minutes. By the 3rd week, the fatigue arrived, the way she'd been told it would, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small subtractions. He noticed it before she said anything. The responses came at 6 minutes instead of 4. The notes she sent him at night were slightly shorter, the sentences slightly less dense. He didn't mention it. He just started sending the documents she needed in formats that required less back and forth, and she noticed this without commenting on it, and he knew she'd noticed because she stopped asking him to send revised versions and just used what he sent. That was how they communicated now, in the spaces between words. Holloway moved on a Thursday in the third week of treatment. Philip called Lucas at 7:43 in the morning with a voice that was doing the thing it did when something had already happened. "Emergency board session," Philip said. "Richard called it for this afternoon at 3. He has a formal motion and he has 5 votes." A pause. "He also has something else, something I haven't seen yet." His assistant said it was new documentation. Lucas was already standing up from his desk. "Does Ava know?" "She's in treatment right now. I'm calling her the moment she's out." "Don't," Lucas said. "I'll go to the clinic. I'll tell her in person." Philip was quiet for a second. "Lucas?" "I'll be there, dear," Lucas said. He was already putting on his coat. He drove to the oncology clinic on Wentworth Street and sat in the waiting area, and did something he almost never did. He didn't open his laptop, didn't check his phone, didn't work. He just sat there and waited. He was done by the time the door opened and Ava came out and saw him in the chair and stopped walking completely. Her first expression was alarm. He shook his head, one small movement, to tell her it wasn't medical. Her second expression was the one that meant she understood something serious had happened, and she was already processing it. He stood up and walked to her and said quietly, "Holloway called an emergency session for 3 o'clock. He has 5 votes and something new." He held her gaze. "We have about 6 hours." She looked at him. She was wearing the slight pallor of someone who had just finished a radiation session, and she was holding her coat over her arm because she hadn't had a chance to put it on yet, and she looked at him with absolute steadiness and said, "Tell me everything on the way to the building." He told her. All of it, everything Philip had said in the car on the way downtown. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The new documentation, it's the billing records again." Philip thinks so. He can't use them. We established that in December. He may have found a different channel, a different form of the same information that doesn't carry the same legal liability. Lucas kept his eyes on the road. Or it's something else entirely. She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think it is?" He had been thinking about this since Philip's call. "I think it's about us," he said. Silence. "He's been watching," Lucas said. "He's been quiet for 6 weeks and he's been watching. And if he has someone inside the building who's been paying attention," he stopped. "The dinners, the hospital visits, the emergency contact listing that's in the hospital's administrative system. If he went looking, he would find a pattern," she said. "He would find a narrative," Lucas said. "A CEO in cancer treatment who has developed a personal relationship with a junior analyst who has had access to every piece of sensitive documentation related to the company's strategic position for the past 6 months. He paused. "In Holloway's hands, that becomes a conflict of interest story. It becomes a judgment story." She said nothing for a long moment. "He's going to use me against you," Lucas said. "That's the new documentation. I think he's been building a case that your relationship with me represents a material lapse in executive judgment, and he's going to put it in front of the board this afternoon." Another silence. Longer. "Ava," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. Her voice was flat and clear, and he recognized it as the voice she used when she was 3 steps ahead of the conversation and needed 30 seconds to close the gap. He let her think. She spoke when they were 2 blocks from the building. "If that's the case," she said, "then the answer is not to hide it. The answer is to make it not a vulnerability." She paused. "If we are engaged formally on record, then there is no undisclosed conflict of interest. It becomes a disclosed personal relationship, which is a different category entirely." He pulled into the parking garage. He cut the engine. He turned to look at her. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying we tell them the truth," she said, "all of it. That I asked you to marry me, that you said yes. That it happened after the surgery in the context of a personal relationship that developed over months of professional collaboration, none of which influenced any documented decision." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to let him make what happened between us into a weapon. So we take it away from him." He looked at her for a long moment in the quiet of the parking garage. "Ava," he said carefully, "are you doing this because it's strategically necessary or because—" Both, she said. Her voice was completely even. It is strategically sound. And it is also true. Both of those things are equally real. She held his gaze with the same directness she had used in room 412 when she'd asked the four words. Does that change anything for you? He thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. No, he said. It doesn't change anything. Good, she said. She opened the car door and put on her coat. Then let's go end Richard Holloway's career. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that compress themselves in memory because there is too much in them to hold in sequence. Philip met them in the lobby, and the three of them spent 40 minutes in the conference room on 12, reconstructing the argument, anticipating every version of what Holloway might present, and building responses that were clean and documented and unassailable. Lucas produced 3 pieces of analysis he'd had ready since January, had always kept ready, because he had understood from the beginning that this day was a possibility. Philip looked at the documents and said quietly, "When did you prepare these?" Lucas said November. Philip looked at him for a moment and then looked at Ava and didn't say what he was thinking, which was the right call. At 1:15, Ava's oncologist called her cell. She stepped out of the conference room to take it. Lucas and Philip kept working. She was back at 4 minutes. "The preliminary blood work from this morning," she said, sitting back down with her legal pad. "The markers are down." She said it the way she said everything factually without inflation. But her hand, when she picked up her pen, was not entirely steady. "The oncologist says the treatment is responding better than projected." Philip exhaled audibly. Lucas looked at her. "That's very good news." "Yes," she said, and she pressed her lips together for exactly 1 second in a way that he recognized as Ava Sinclair, allowing herself to feel something fully before she put it away and got back to work. "It is." She looked at the documents. "Where were we?" They were at the third counter argument. They finished it in 20 minutes. At 2:45, they walked into the boardroom. Holloway was already there, seated 3 chairs down from the head of the table, flanked by 2 of his allied board members. He looked at Ava when she walked in, and his expression was the expression of a man who has decided he is holding something and is waiting to use it. His eyes moved to Lucas, who had come in behind Ava, and something shifted in Holloway's face, a sharpening of satisfaction, the look of a man who has arranged pieces on a board and is watching them arrive where he intended them to be. He didn't know yet that the board had changed shape. Philip called the session to order at 3:01. There were 9 board members present. 4 of them had texted Ava since December 21st. She knew where she stood with each of them. She had always known where she stood with each of them because Ava Sinclair did not walk into rooms without knowing the architecture. Holloway spoke first. He was good at it, controlled, collegial in tone, constructed with the precision of someone who had spent real money on the argument. He presented his case in 4 sections. The first 3 were about the cancer treatment, the ongoing nature of it, the projected timeline, the question of executive bandwidth. Lucas had expected this, and the documentation Philip was already distributing made it irrelevant before Holloway finished the sentence. The 4th section was about Lucas. Holloway laid it out cleanly: the relationship, the timeline, the access. He had building security logs showing Lucas's after-hours presence on the executive floor. He had the hospital's visitor log from January 14th. He had somehow a record of the emergency contact listing, which meant he had someone inside St. Carmichael's administrative system, which was a problem for a different day. He presented it not as a scandal, but as a governance failure, an undisclosed relationship between the CEO and a junior employee with material access to sensitive strategic information. He was good. Lucas would give him that. If he hadn't known what was coming, it would have landed. Ava let him finish, all of it. She sat at the head of the table and did not move, and did not speak until Holloway was completely done and the room had settled into the particular silence of 9 people waiting to find out what happens next. Then she said, "Lucas Bennett and I are engaged to be married." The silence changed entirely. "We became engaged in early February following a relationship that developed over the course of our professional collaboration, and that has been conducted with full integrity at every stage. There is no undisclosed conflict of interest because I am disclosing it now in this room to this board with complete documentation of every decision I made during the period in question available for review." She nodded to Philip, who began distributing the second set of documents. What Richard is characterizing as a vulnerability is a personal relationship between 2 consenting adults. What he is not telling you is that the documentation he obtained from St. Carmichael Medical Center's administrative system was obtained without authorization, which my attorney will be formally addressing with the hospital and with the relevant authorities beginning tomorrow morning. One of the board members, a woman named Carolyn Marsh, who had been on the board for 6 years and had voted for Ava's initial appointment, looked at Holloway. Richard, is that accurate? How was this documentation obtained? Holloway's composure did not break, but something in it became structural, the kind of composure that is held together from the outside rather than the inside. The documentation was obtained through a third-party records retrieval firm, Ava said, which we have already identified, and which accessed protected health records without a valid subpoena or patient consent, which is a HIPAA violation. She looked at Holloway directly. Richard, you have spent 9 years trying to remove me from this company. You have been wrong every time. And this time you have not just been wrong, you have exposed yourself and potentially this board to significant legal liability in pursuit of a personal agenda. She paused. I'm going to give you the opportunity to withdraw this motion before the vote. The room was completely still. Holloway looked at her. For the first time in 9 years of looking at Ava Sinclair across tables, he looked like a man who had just understood that the ground he was standing on was not the ground he had thought it was. The motion stands, he said. His voice was even, but something behind it had shifted. Then we'll vote, Ava said. The vote was 7-2 to 1. Holloway sat in his chair for 3 seconds after Philip announced the count, and then he stood up and buttoned his jacket and walked out of the boardroom without speaking to anyone. The board member who had voted with him, a man named Gerald Pitch, who had been following Holloway's lead for 4 years, looked at the table and said nothing. Carolyn Marsh waited until the door had closed and then said to no one in particular, "Well, that's been a long time coming." The room exhaled. Philip was already on his phone. Lucas sat in his chair and let the last 3 hours decompress slowly, the way pressure releases after a long dive, not all at once carefully, because the speed matters. Ava was speaking to Caroline Marsh. Her voice was composed and warm, and she was already transitioning the conversation toward the company's next quarter, which was exactly what you did when you won. You moved forward immediately because the forward motion was the point. She caught his eye across the table while she was speaking and held it for just a moment. It was not a dramatic moment. She didn't smile. She didn't perform anything. She just looked at him for 1 second with the expression he had been cataloging for months. The real one, the full one, the one that was only for him. And then she looked back at Caroline Marsh and kept talking. That was it. That was the whole of it. And it was more than enough. 3 weeks later, on a Friday morning in late March, Ava walked into a building she owned for the first time as a woman whose doctors had used the word remission. She had called Lucas at 6:30 in the morning with the result, which was earlier than she usually called, and which told him everything before she said a word. She said, "The markers are gone." And then she said nothing else for a moment, and in that silence, he could hear exactly what it cost her to hold together. And he didn't fill the silence, and she found her way back from the edge of it on her own, because that was who she was. "Ava," he said. "I'm here," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you are." She was quiet for another moment. "I'll see you in the building." He was there when she arrived. He was at his desk where he always was. She walked through the floor in her coat, with her reading glasses on her head and her phone in her hand, and she was exactly herself, all of it. The whole assembled, formidable construct of her, and she stopped at his desk for exactly 30 seconds. "The oncologist wants quarterly monitoring," she said. "The first review is in April." "I'll be there," he said. "I know." She held his gaze for 1 moment. "The Q2 projections." "On your desk." She nodded. She walked to her office. The door closed. Philip stopped by Lucas's desk 20 minutes later and set a coffee beside his keyboard without saying anything, which was Philip's way of saying everything. Lucas picked up the coffee and drank it and kept working. The wedding was in June. It was small, deliberately architecturally small, in the way that everything Ava chose was deliberate. 12 people, a judge she had known for years, a restaurant in the same neighborhood as the Thai place because she had said she wanted somewhere that felt real, and he had said that was the only requirement he had too. She wore something simple and dark, and she did not carry flowers because she had told him flowers were a convention she found impractical, and he had said fair enough and meant it completely. He wore a suit she had looked at on his phone screen and said was the right one, and he had trusted her on that because she was right about most things, and specifically right about things that required precision. Philip cried. He tried not to, very hard, and failed completely, which was the most human Lucas had ever seen him be. Carolyn Marsh had sent a gift with a note that said, "I've been watching that woman for 6 years. You may be the first person she's ever let see her clearly. Don't waste it." He didn't intend to. The moment that stayed with him was not the ceremony. It was earlier that morning when he had arrived at the restaurant before anyone else and found her already there sitting at the bar with a coffee and her phone reading something. She hadn't heard him come in. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, just Ava in a quiet room, before any of it began. She looked up and saw him. She set her phone down. "You're early," she said. "So are you." She looked at him. "I didn't want to be late to my own wedding." "Neither did I." She held his gaze across the empty room, and then she said quietly, with no audience and no performance and nothing at all to prove, "I'm glad you came to the hospital that morning, January, when you didn't have to." He crossed the room and sat on the stool beside her. "I know," he said. "I'm glad too. I should have said that before now. You said it in other ways." She considered this. "I'm going to work on saying things directly," she said. "It's a practice. I'm not naturally—" She stopped. "I don't find it easy." "I know you don't," he said. "I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for honest." She looked at him. "I can do honest." "I know you can," he said. "You're one of the most honest people I've ever met." Something shifted in her face, quiet and real and completely unguarded. The way she was only in these small private moments that neither of them marked because they didn't need to. She picked up her coffee. She looked forward. "What do you think the board is going to say?" she said. He laughed, not the managed kind, the real kind, the involuntary kind, the kind she kept producing in him without trying. "I think Philip will handle it," he said. "Philip always handles it," she said. "That's why he's still employed." She smiled, actually smiled, the real one, in the empty restaurant on her wedding morning. And it did what it always did. It changed her face into the face of the woman from Tennessee who had been told she was too much and had decided that too much was exactly right. He had proposed formally. He wanted that on the record. 3 weeks after February, on an evening at her apartment with no documentation involved and no strategy required. He had told her he wanted to do it properly because she deserved the proper version, and he had said the words simply, directly, in the language of someone who had found what he'd been looking for and was not going to obscure that with decoration. She had said yes, and then she had said, "I already asked you." He said, "I know, I'm asking back." She had looked at him for a moment. "That's not how it works." "It is now," he said. She had shaken her head. She had said yes again. And he had understood in that moment that this was what the rest of it was going to look like. Two people who both had opinions about methodology at 11 at night, and both arrived early to things they cared about, and both had learned through separate difficult paths that the most important skill was not being strong enough to carry everything alone, but being honest enough to know when you didn't have to. After the wedding and the quiet of the evening, when the 12 guests had gone, and it was just the two of them, she said something he had not expected. "I'm pregnant." He looked at her. 8 weeks, she said. "The oncologist confirmed it's safe to continue. The treatment protocol we used has no documented impact on Archeum." She stopped, looked at him. "I found out the same morning as the remission results. I didn't say anything because I needed to know the remission was real first." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you now because you said honest." He sat with it, all of it. The morning phone call, the word remission, the wedding, and now this 8 weeks, a fact she had been carrying alongside the best news of her medical life, waiting until the right moment to hand it to him. He thought about the woman who had spent her whole life carrying everything alone. The woman who had learned before she was 20 that the people you love get sick and you handle it and you keep moving. The woman who had built an empire from the ground up and held the board vote and walked into every hard room without blinking and had still in the end needed to be chosen. He looked at her. "Are you," he started. "Terrified," she said before he could finish. "Yes." She held his gaze steadily. "I am also," a pause, the kind of pause she took when she was being precise about something that mattered. "I am also more certain about this than I have been about almost anything." He reached across and took her hand. She looked at their hands. She breathed. I don't know how to do this part, she said. The family part. I didn't have mine was complicated. I don't have a template. Neither do I, he said. I have a failed marriage and a father who worked a plant for 30 years and died before I could ask him the things I should have asked him. He held her hand steadily. We'll figure it out the same way we figured out everything else. We'll be honest about what we don't know, and we'll work on it until we do. She looked at him, and he watched it happen the last wall. The deepest one, the one that had been there since before he knew her, since Tennessee, and her mother's kitchen, and the years of being too much of carrying everything alone, of learning to survive by refusing to need, he watched that wall come down. Not dramatically, not all at once, just it came down. Quietly, completely, the way things come down when they've been held up long enough, and the reason to hold them finally stops. Okay, she said. Her voice was different than it had ever been. Softer than the hospital, softer than the boardroom, softer than the Thai restaurant, or the hallway, or the doorstep on the January night. Just Ava, fully and finally without armor, holding his hand in the quiet of the evening. Okay, he said. And that was the word they built everything on. Not a vow, not a declaration, not a carefully constructed argument for a board of 9. Just that one plain word said twice between two people who had found each other in the middle of the hardest years of their lives and had chosen deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, with eyes open to every risk, to stop walking alone. Ava Sinclair had spent 30 years being too much for every room she walked into, and she had finally found the one person for whom she was exactly enough. And Lucas Bennett, who had driven across the city on a January morning because his body refused to let a woman face surgery alone, understood at last what he had always been moving toward. Not a destination, not a resolution, but a person, a life, a choice. Made every morning with the full weight of everything it carried. They chose it. Every day without hesitation for all the days that followed, they chose it.